Well, hello, everybody. It is good to see you. Want to start like we do every week. Want to welcome our campuses, Kenosha campus, Racine campus. Hello to you. We welcome all of our friends online in different parts of the country and hopefully even around the world. Actually, we do have people in different parts of the world who watch, and so we want to welcome you to our friends at Timberlake Church in the Seattle area, where there are more campuses than McDonald's franchises. I'll tell you what, we welcome you. We love you guys. And then to the people in the room with me, hello to you. Woo! I love the energy. Guys, it's hard to believe. Christmas is right around the corner. Now, this is what's crazy, is for adults, this time of year typically flies by, but for kids, it is agonizingly slow. Right? You know this is true. And it's the reason why back in the 1950s, candy companies decided to play into that slow pain for children by creating these chocolate advent calendars. Right? And if you've ever had the chocolate, they're not that good. Right? This is not that good. They're about the size of a cashew, but they kind of help kids make it through this time of year. And one of the reasons that I'm convinced it's so painfully slow, and it feels like eternity for kids to get to Christmas morning, is because kids really just have fun through the holidays. It's like zero stress for them, right? They don't have to think about making meals. They just get to eat meals. They get to play with their cousins. They're not stressed about who's going to show up. They don't really care. They just are there. And of course, number one, what are they thinking about? Presents. Yeah. So whether your family exchanges a lot of gifts or just a couple of gifts, there's just something special about Christmas gifts and kind of anticipating what you're going to get. And every year it feels like there's a hot item. Right? When I was 14 years old, this was 1989, the gift that I was hoping desperately to get, and it actually had been around for a while, just a couple of years by that point, but was a Nintendo, right? I know some of you remember this, right? Others of you, this is just like a museum for you, but that's okay. I was just hoping for a Nintendo. We had an Atari, but this was like the big upgrade, right? And my parents weren't in a position to get it, but my grandma Nelson bought one for me and for my brothers, right? We had to share it, but that's okay because we had Super Mario Brothers, and what other game came with it? Duck Hunt, woo! Trip down memory lane. Now, ironically, I have a 14-year-old son right now. He would love to have a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X. But guess what? I'm not his grandma. So it ain't going to happen, right? About 10 years ago, and this just tells you how quickly gifts change, the big gift that my daughters wanted was they wanted an iPod Touch Generation 4. They thought that was so cool, and they got it, and they were grateful for a couple weeks, and then they start talking about what? A phone. Like that had to be the next upgrade. This is just how it goes. But every year has a special gift, right? Every decade has a special gift. If you were to go back to my parents' generation, right? They're growing up in the early 50s, the big gift from that time period, this is not a joke. It was Mr. Potato Head. Like with real potatoes. Ooh, so fun. It's like a Jack in the Box. Woo, a Slinky. Yeah, good times. If you're like, man, I actually remember Christmas before the 1950s. We're just glad you're here. We're glad you're still alive. I will talk loud and slow and make this a great day for you. But guys, here's the deal. We've all experienced at some point, usually it's when we're kids, the agonizing wait for Christmas to arrive. This year, though, I think a lot of adults have felt like it's taking a while for Christmas to show up. Because, of course, it's been a challenging year. As a nation, we've dealt with political issues, we've dealt with racial tensions, we've dealt with fears related to pandemic. We've really had all sorts of issues that divide us as people, and so we've had to go through all that stuff. On top of that, I know this is the case, that each of us as individuals have our own things we're wrestling with, whether it's mental health issues, or depression, substance abuse, maybe health-related issues, financial issues, marriage, parenting issues. Every single one of us this Christmas season, if we're just honest, could probably identify a mess in our life. And what many of us desperately need right now is a miracle. Now, I got to tell you, even though I'm a pastor, I don't typically talk about miracles. And there's a couple of reasons why. Number one, it's a hard word to pronounce, right? Is it miracle? Miracle? Like, I don't even know the right pronunciation, but it just feels weird on that. And then secondly, there's something about it that feels mystical. And so if I'm the pastor who's always talking about miracles, then I just feel like I'm going to have this reputation of like, oh, I bet you Dave also sees UFOs and talks to aliens and he believes in a flat earth, right? There's something about the whole idea or concept of miracles that's a little unique because a miracle is unexplainable. And it's not my comfort zone to talk about it. And yet the reality is, I think a lot of us are hoping for a miracle this Christmas. Right now, there are thousands and thousands of small business owners in our country. They're carrying a huge weight financially. A lot of them are trying to figure out, hey, are we even going to be able to be open in 2021? Like, is our business going to survive? And I know many of those small business owners are absolutely hoping and praying for a miracle. Right now, all over our country, there are cancer patients looking outside their hospital windows, knowing it's going to be a difficult Christmas for them. They're exhausted from chemotherapy. They're fearful of what the next checkup might reveal. And it's just clear that they're hoping, they're praying for a miracle. Right now, there are parents, many of them single parents, who are just living with the stress of a child who's gone down a dark path or a dangerous path, and they're praying for them. But their kids aren't listening to them. They're not seeking help. Many of those kids don't even want to acknowledge something's wrong. Those parents are hoping for a miracle this season. Right now, there are many, many individuals who in their hearts, they want to adopt a child, but then they look at the cost, they look at the complexities, they look at the uncertainty of the coming year, and it's just kind of overwhelming, and they're hoping and praying for a miracle this Christmas. When we look at our mess and we acknowledge, I need a miracle, I need God to intervene, I need God to step in, it may be hard to believe in miracles, but I want to tell you, I do believe God can do something miraculous. And the good news for all of us, and I know this sounds very cliche, is that God can take a mess and turn it into a miracle. God can bring beauty out of ashes. God can bring good from bad situations. God can create meaning from the hurt and from the pain that we go through in life. But the reality is, when you struggle with something for a long time and you're working really hard to see some progress and you're not seeing progress and you're praying and God's not answering your prayers, at some point you begin to conclude, well, I'm never going to be happy again. Nothing good is going to come from this. At some point you just say, I don't even know if there's a point in continuing. Because our tendency, when we go through difficult times over an extended period, and it goes from season to season and nothing's happening, is we just conclude, well, God is distant. God is absent. God is uninterested in me. God is uninterested in what's happening in our world. And then we lose our joy and we lose our hope and we start to lose a sense of purpose. But what I want to do today is I want to walk us through a story that is a powerful reminder of how God is always at work, whether we realize it or not. Now, you know this, Christmas is filled with stories. Right? Whether it's the story of Linus reciting the Christmas tale in A Charlie Brown Christmas, or Rudolph not being able to play in any of the reindeer games, or for a lot of us, Clark Griswold, this is like our big story, right? Trying to get power to the Christmas lights on top of the house. But the story we're going to look at is different. I'm just going to tell you, it is not the easiest to understand. It's not this entertaining story where we're all going to laugh. And so it is super, super important that you pay really close attention for the next 3 or 4 minutes. Which, if you're not on Adderall, that is a long time. Let's just be honest, right? Scientists say that we have a shorter attention span than a goldfish, right? Goldfish is like 9 seconds, humans 8 seconds, all right? But you're going to need to pay attention because I'm going to give you some details that set up the story. It's a little bit of a history lesson. And so to understand the story, we have to understand about the nation of Israel. Israel started out as just a small tribe of people, a handful of people. And then over the course of hundreds of years, they had lots and lots of babies. They didn't have birth control, right? So lots and lots of babies. They started buying up lots and lots, or acquiring, not buying up, but acquiring lots and lots of property. And eventually it grew into a really big nation. Now, I say big nation, but relatively, this is the size of New Jersey, okay? But that is the nation of Israel. And as you can imagine, with a nation this size, the need for leadership is very strong. And so initially there were judges who led Israel, and then what ended up happening is kings led Israel. The first king of Israel was a guy named Saul, then a guy named David, and the third king was a guy named Solomon. Well, when Solomon died, there was civil war that broke out, and the nation split into two different nations. All right? And so you had the north part of Israel that retained the name Israel, and then you had the southern part that carried the name of Judah. So at the time of this story, the king of Judah is a guy by the name of Ahaz. And Ahaz has a real dilemma on his hands because he is responsible for protecting Judah. The problem is, right above Israel, right, a couple hundred miles away to the north, is the Assyrian Empire. These are the ferocious warriors of the day. These are mean-spirited people. There is nothing nice about them, right? They were not the Libertarian Party, I'm going to tell you that. Right? These weren't the friendly, just get along with everybody type of people. They were constantly going to war against other countries and destroying them. So those are the details that set up the story. You've got King Ahaz. He's terrified that the Assyrian armies are going to come down and attack Judah. On top of that, there's a coalition of different tribes and nations getting together who say, well, we're going to attack Assyria. And they want King Ahaz to join them, and King Ahaz says, hey, I'm not going to join you. And so it's just this big dilemma. Well, historically, when the Jewish people have experienced moments like this, and they've been in seasons like this, God has protected them. But Ahaz was not a godly king. Right? He didn't have much leverage with God, and so he didn't know what to do. And it's into this very tense situation, God sends a man by the name of Isaiah. And he has a very specific message for Ahaz. Now, Isaiah was a prophet, which means he would give a specific message from God to a king, to a leader, or to a group of people. And the message that Isaiah gives to King Ahaz is this: I know you're afraid, but you don't need to be. Don't be afraid. Don't lose hope. Because from the perspective of God, the nations that you're so afraid of, the alliances that are forming, the coalitions that are getting together, man, it's already finished for everybody. It's just over. You don't have to worry. But Ahaz is scared to death. And Isaiah knows this. And so he says to Ahaz, hey, listen, if you doubt God's going to protect you, ask God for a sign. Ask him for any sign. I mean, God has done crazy miracles throughout history. You can ask him for any miracle. I'm going to tell you, he's going to give it to you. And here's how King Ahaz responded. But the king refused. No, he said, I will not test the Lord like that. So Ahaz says, I'm not going to play games with God. I'm not going to put God to the test. And for a moment, it looks like Ahaz has this deep respect for God. But the fact is, Ahaz had already put a plan together. Ahaz was in talks with Assyria. He was trying to pay them money. He was trying to assure them cooperation if they would kind of make sure he didn't get attacked by the coalition. It's just all this crazy stuff happening. It was obvious that he did not trust God to protect him and the people of Judah. And so Isaiah responds to the king. And he says, hey, listen, since you have decided not to pick a sign, God is going to pick a sign. You don't want to put God to the test? God is going to put himself to the test. And he's going to give you a sign to prove that even when circumstances are out of control, he is ultimately still in control. Here's what Isaiah says to King Ahaz in response to him saying, well, I'm not going to ask for a sign. Isaiah says, all right then, the Lord himself will give you the sign. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. This is really ambiguous, right? This is like, it makes very little sense. A young woman is going to have a baby and the name has already been picked out. Woo! I mean, this could apply to so many people. And as you can imagine, it had very little impact on King Ahaz. It didn't make sense. And so he doesn't budge. And then Isaiah, he goes off on some rant about how Israel and Judah are going to go through some really bad days and things are going to get terrible for them. And how things are going to seem hopeless. But he says, things aren't going to stay hopeless forever. He says, it's going to be dark for a while, but those living in darkness will see a great light. And then he explains what he means. And he says something that we see on Christmas cards this time of year. We see it on social media posts. He says this: For a child is born to us. A son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. What? For a child is born to us. Okay. That can mean anybody. Is it Haley Baldwin's going to have a kid? Is it, is it Oprah's going to have a kid? Who's going to have a kid, right? A son is given to us. Well, there's no ultrasounds. So it's a 50-50 shot. Okay, so you know the gender has been picked out. The government will rest on his shoulder. We don't really know what that means. It sounds like he's going to have a position in government. That's great. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This is where things start to get interesting. Isaiah says, hey, there's a baby that's going to be born. The baby's going to be very, very special. And he seems to indicate when he says he will be referred to as Mighty God, he seems to indicate that God at some level is going to enter this planet in a human body. But it's really, really mysterious. And so Ahaz just blows it off. And he walks away and he does what he wants to do. And sure enough, everything Isaiah said would happen, happened. Israel lost its place of prominence in the world. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, power shifted from nation to nation. Israel loses its influence and its leverage economically and politically. I mean, think of all of the frustrations related to a pandemic and all of the arguments and all of the things that have taken place this year. It's nothing compared to the hundreds and hundreds of years that Israel went through of difficulty. And then, after hundreds of years, God goes silent. For over 400 years, we have absolutely no record of any evidence of God's activity in the nation of Israel. The glory days of Israel are long forgotten. The New England Patriots without Tom Brady are going to be able to relate to that. This is just a little side note, right? Now, just in case you're a little bit lost, let me summarize everything we just went through. Ahaz is king of Judah. The people of Judah are terrified of Assyria. Isaiah tells King Ahaz that Judah would be safe if Ahaz would seek God's help and protection. Instead, King Ahaz seeks protection from Assyria. And Isaiah tells Ahaz that bad things will happen now, but they won't stay bad forever. And then he says the proof that God is ultimately in control is the birth of a baby. 735 years after Isaiah makes that prophetic statement, this statement about the future. When the table was set just the way God wanted it, Jesus is born. In Matthew, who is a disciple of Jesus, he writes about this event, and he adds some of his own commentary. Here's what Matthew says. He says, all of this occurred, referring to the birth of a baby, all of this occurred to fulfill the Lord's message through his prophet. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. All of this, the birth of Jesus, is a fulfillment of what Isaiah prophesied 735 years earlier. To the majority of the Jews, it looked like God had forgotten them. Many of them had just kind of given up on the whole idea. It looked like they had been abandoned. It looked like God was uninterested in them, but he was actually active the entire time. My inability to see, hear, or feel God does not mean that God is absent. See, Christmas is a celebration of the birth of Jesus. And I love all the fun expressions we have, right? Elf on the shelf, Santa Claus, exchanging gifts, nativity scenes, Christmas trees, right? All the songs. I played my drum for him. I just wanted to hear you say that. That was awesome, right? But all of that stuff, and I love all that stuff. And I know that we know that Christmas is the birth of Jesus. But what I also hope we know is that Christmas is a celebration of God making good on a promise from 735 years earlier. A promise that a baby would be born and carry the title God with us. God in the midst of us. For hundreds and hundreds of years, everybody had an idea of what God was like. They had images in their mind of what they assumed God was like. Now God was going to reveal himself to the world. What was God going to be like? There's an app or a game that you can download on your phone. You can download it to your tablet. It's called Pocket God. It's part of a genre of games called God games where you get to play the part of God, And kind of part of the advertisement of the game is the question, what kind of God would you be? And so in this game, you get to play this part of God where you're in control of everything for these very primitive individuals living on an island. So if you want to move the sun closer, you can burn them up. If you want to move the sun far away, they can freeze. If you want, you can flick them into the ocean and they'll be eaten by sharks. You just have all this power, right? You can shake the island and it'd be like an earthquake for them. You can torture them if you want. You can just do whatever you want. And I was thinking this week, how fun would that be to just have the role of God for a while in real life? Especially when it was political season. Or you could just mess with people. You can make people shut up. You can make people say things they never intended to say. You could cause a fly to land on a candidate's head if you wanted. I mean, you could do whatever you wanted to do. But the game raises the question, is God really in control? Does God really know what we are going through? Is he really aware? And if he is, does he really care? Well, the birth of Jesus says that he is. He is God with us. And he does care. He's not God above us. He's not God a million miles away. He's God with us. Even when I don't see it, God is working. And even when I can't feel it, God is working. He never stops. He never stops working. God is in control even when my life feels out of control. I have a good buddy who has an older sister, and his older sister battled drugs for most of her adult life, for roughly 20 years. 17 years ago, my buddy's sister gave birth to a baby girl. And unfortunately, because there was drugs in her system, the state took the baby away. She fought for custody, but the state said no. And so my friend Tom and his wife Jackie, they decided they were going to step in and adopt this baby girl. Now, a little side note is for several years, Tom and Jackie had been trying to have a baby, and they were unable to. And so they end up adopting their niece. So what was a painful season for Tom and Jackie, what was a painful season for Tom's sister, ends up being a moment where God works in the pain. 3 years after the adoption, Tom's sister tragically passes away. The good news is Molly, her daughter, has grown up in a stable family where she is deeply loved. Now, if you were to peel back the layers of that story, Tom and Jackie would tell you there's pain and hurt and questions and drama, and there's all sorts of stuff there as they were kind of going through this season. And that stuff didn't magically disappear. Some of it, they still have to deal with the repercussions of choices that were made. But God moved in the midst of it. There's not a bow on a flawless package of their story. It's not like everybody lives happily ever after, but God brought purpose and he brought meaning out of their pain. And in life, what often happens, and it's so frustrating, is we're looking at a puzzle piece, right? We're looking at one or two pieces of the puzzle, and it's kind of our life, and it's so frustrating because we can't make sense of it. God understands what the big picture looks like, but only God. And often it takes us years and years and years to begin to see the bigger picture. Often we don't ever get to see it. We just have to wait. And waiting is never fun. But what waiting does is it gives us a little bit of perspective. Right? Without perspective, what ends up happening is we make quick decisions and we damage our life. Without perspective, we rush things. If you really think about it, it's our inability to delay gratification that's the cause of so much pain in our life. It's the cause of a lot of financial debt. We didn't want to wait till we had the money to afford it. It's the cause of sexual regrets. It's the cause of relationship issues. We wish we could get in a time machine and go back and undo that and not say that and undo that situation, right? As humans, there's something in us that if we don't have perspective, we just try to make things happen ourselves. And if we choose that we're not going to do that, we get really desperate and we say, God, I need a miracle and I need a miracle right now. But whatever miracle you are waiting on today, let me encourage you with this. God may be silent, but do not interpret God's silence as absence. God does not move quickly. It's like when you're standing behind someone and you're trying to move somewhere and they're just moving way slower than you think is acceptable. And you're trying to kind of dodge them one way or the other, right? And they're just kind of minding their own way. God just moves slow. We're looking at the minute hand. We're looking sometimes at the hour hand. God is looking at the calendar. King Solomon of Israel writes this. He says, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. So if you're in a season where you are waiting on God to do something or to fix something or to change something, I have a challenge for you. My challenge is this: actively wait on God for a miracle. Do not be passive in your waiting. Do not just sit back and pray and just say, God, whatever happens, whenever it happens, it's all up to you. That's a great attitude, but be active in your waiting. Let's work on our character while we're waiting for God to do something. Let's work on ourselves. In some cases, maybe we need to meet with a therapist and say, all right, I'm waiting on God to do a miracle, but I'm gonna do something here. If you're waiting on a financial miracle, maybe for you the next step is sitting down and creating a budget, or maybe it's meeting with a financial advisor. Let's do what we are able to do while we're waiting for God to do what he is able to do. Because the reality is God moves slowly. And one of the reasons that God moves slowly is God is more concerned about what happens in us than what happens to us. I know, lame. Right? Because we're concerned about what happens to us. God's way more concerned about what happens in us than what happens to us. And almost every single person whose life story we read about in the ancient scriptures, they spent years. You're not going to want to hear this next thing. Often decades, waiting for God to answer their prayers and to fulfill a promise he had made to them. And so while we are waiting on God to do a miracle, God invites us to seek him and to know him and to experience him in palatable ways. And so my prayer for all of us is that while we're waiting on God for a miracle, that we would experience the good news of the reality that God is with us in the midst of everything we're going through. And so my hope and my prayer is that we will experience the God that Isaiah talked about. A God who is a wonderful counselor, the God who guides. A wonderful counselor means that his wisdom goes beyond what's common, right? He's a counselor who produces wonder in people. There's something unexpected about it. Years ago, I was in a group of guys, and the purpose of the group was we were working on being better husbands. And one of the guys in the group one week said, one of the things that's just kind of helped my marriage is every day I just ask my wife how she's doing. And it was so funny to me. Some dude busted out like an old school notebook and like started to write. I said, what are you writing? He said, I think that's a good idea. I said, you have to write down to ask your wife how her day was, like how she's doing? What? Like to me, that's just common sense, right? But he wrote it down. There is something that's very different about the wisdom of God. It is unexpected, which is why whenever we read a reaction by people to the teachings of Jesus, it was either A, they were amazed and astonished, or B, they were offended. There was really no middle ground. The wisdom of God goes against the grain of culture. So think about this. Let's just think about the reality that we live in a time period where everything we watch or read or listen to or every advertisement that we come across is about experiencing our best life now, like today. That's very normal for thinking. But when you read through the teachings of Jesus, he constantly taught that true blessing comes with those who live in light of eternity. Blessed are those who defer to others. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Right, so common sense is if somebody hurts you, retaliate against them. Jesus taught, pray for those who hurt you. Do good to them. It goes against every fabric of our being. And I bring this up because maybe the miracle you're hoping for in your relationship is going to require you to humble yourself and to forgive someone who doesn't even acknowledge they are wrong. I've had to do that so many times in my life. And I can tell you, it never gets easier. It takes months, often years. But maybe the miracle you're hoping for with your teenage child, maybe it's going to require you to give up your idealistic hopes of what they will be someday and embrace the reality of who they are today and find ways to express love to them right now in this moment. Maybe the miracle that you're hoping for in your career is going to require you to pray for the people who hurt you and let you go. Jesus said, do these things so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Do these things so you will reflect the character of God. God is way more interested in what happens in us than he is in what happens to us. So what would happen if we really believed in the midst of our pain and hurts and questions and doubts? What would happen if we really got to the point where we believe, this isn't fun, I want to be rescued, I want God to do something, but I do believe God's with me right now in the midst of this? What if we believe that God's constantly trying to guide us through the teachings of Jesus and through the writings that make up our Bible and through the godly people in our lives and through the circumstances and events that we go through and through the promptings that we feel? What if we believe that God really was a wonderful counselor? Isaiah said he's a wonderful counselor, but he also said he's a mighty God. He's the God who conquers. Every religion teaches a very similar thing about God, and that is we have to walk up or crawl up or somehow get up a ladder of behavior to connect with God. But the God that's talked about all throughout the scriptures is a God who comes down to us. It is the biggest miracle of all. God becoming human. The author of Hebrews puts it this way. He says, the Son radiates God's own glory and expresses the very character of God, and he sustains everything by the mighty power of his command. God enters the world as a helpless baby, but in reality, he is a warrior and he is a conqueror. He's a God who frees us from the oppression of always having to measure up to some standard of behavior to be accepted. He's a God who brings light into the darkness of life. He's a God whose ultimate power is seen on a cross, where he becomes a sacrifice for sins of all people. The true power of God is seen in his willingness to suffer and enter into solidarity with us in our sin. And so what if the biggest miracle that God wants to do in our life this season is simply to soften our hearts and to help us become more and more others-oriented, where we notice people and love people and serve people in ways we never have? God is a conqueror, but here's the thing. He conquers not through force. He conquers through love. He's a wonderful counselor. He's a mighty God. Isaiah says he's an everlasting Father. He's the God who provides. In the ancient Near East, the king of the land was often referred to as the royal father of the nation because he was the one responsible to provide protection and shelter for his people. He was responsible to look after them. That's what he did. He was a father. I wish I had time to really unpack this story, and I don't. But years ago, when I was in my late 20s, I had worked for a guy who I was no longer working for. It was a couple years earlier, and he really, really ticked me off. And so I felt like this compulsion. I could not stop myself. The devil got a hold of me, and I wrote this guy a letter, and it was filled with all sorts of colorful language that I learned from my friend Pastor Ben at Timberlake. And it was filled with venom and language and is all this stuff. Well, here's the deal. It was from one pastor to another pastor, and so I got myself in a lot of trouble. I was part of a church denomination, and I had to go on trial, so to speak, by the Supreme Court, and I'm using language you can understand. They were called presbyters, but I had to stand in front of these presbyters, and I had to explain myself, and I had to go through a lot of questioning. But here's why I'm telling you this. Before I went and met with these guys, my dad, who was living in Kenosha, I was in Chicago at the time, he drives down to Chicago and he meets with me. And my dad says, hey, I know you regret writing a letter, and I'm terrified waiting for my dad to just kind of blast me, right? And he says, I just want you to say, I want you to know that when you stand in front of these guys, it's likely that they're going to make you question whether or not you should be a pastor. And I don't want you to second guess it for a moment. And they're going to make you second guess yourself, whether you love God or not. Do not second guess it for a moment. I'm proud of you, and God still has his hand on your life. God is an everlasting Father. He provides love and meaning and protection and approval and security. And whatever miracle you need, I pray that you experience the miracle of God's love and acceptance for you in the midst of your mess. He's a wonderful counselor, a mighty God, an everlasting Father, and he is the Prince of Peace, the God who makes us whole. He's a God who makes us feel whole and complete. Every one of us deal with insecurity, and it expresses itself differently, right? My insecurity, just like so many of you, I attach my worth to the church, or you attach your work to what you do. And so when the church is moving forward and things are great, I feel great about myself. And when our numbers aren't up, when our giving is kind of wavering, when our mission work isn't what you may have did in a different city, right? I start to question myself a lot. And I have to remind myself that, man, my worth is so much different than what I do or where our church is at in a specific season. I love the words of Jim Carrey, the comedian and actor. They've become very famous. But I love what he says because I think a lot of us need to hear this. He says, I wish everyone could experience being rich and famous so they'd see it wasn't the answer to anything. And basically what Jim Carrey is doing, he's echoing the words Madonna gave in an interview years ago for Vanity Fair magazine. Here's what Madonna said. She said, I have an iron will, and all of my will has always been to conquer some horrible feeling of inadequacy. I push past one spell of it and discover myself as a special human being, and then I get to another stage and think I'm mediocre and uninteresting. She continues, again and again, my drive in life is from this horrible fear of being mediocre, and that's always pushing me. Because even though I become somebody, I still have to prove that somebody. Madonna's words, I'm convinced, are not just a reflection of her life, they're a reflection of the human heart. We're constantly looking to prove our worth, but the Prince of Peace says, you have worth. You have worth. I was looking at some of the decorations on one of our Christmas trees this week, and it was just like, it was obvious these are made like by my daughters when they were young, or my son. And I mean, I think one of my daughters was under the influence when she was painting this thing. And you know, some of these are just straight up ugly. Let's just be honest. Nobody's going to give $1 for them on eBay. They just are. I know that sounds cruel, but they have a lot of value. Why? Because of who made them. I don't want these thrown away. I like seeing them on my tree. Our Heavenly Father says, you're valued, you're mine. And I hope in this season, while we're waiting on a miracle, for God to bring a miracle out of the mess in our life, I hope that we don't miss the biggest miracle of all, and that is God is with us. May we know him as a wonderful counselor and a mighty God and an everlasting Father and the Prince of Peace. Would you pray with me? Our Heavenly Father, I pray that as we wait on you to do a miracle in our life, that you would help us to be active in our waiting. You would give us the wisdom to know what we're supposed to be doing in this season. And as we wait, help us to know and discover you in new and fresh ways. Help us to remember that you are a God who is with us. In Jesus' name, amen.